Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we are finally getting back into the Justice Doom War by Scott Snyder. We are getting into part 2, part dos. And this is going to be kind of a big one here, right? There's a lot going on, but as a bit of a refresher for people who are unfamiliar, right? Because it took us a little while to kind of get back into this. What you basically have here, the kind of big overarching thing, is the return of Perpetua. And the reason why we say the return is because Perpetua was the one who created the multiverse, right? At least this particular multiverse in DC Comics. And the idea was that she was essentially not really governed by so much as ruled over or assisted by these kind of apex predator soldiers. Now, eventually she was defeated by the combined forces of the Monitor, the AntiMonitor, and the Forger of Worlds. And so following her defeat and her imprisonment within the Source Wall, it then turned to the Monitor, the AntiMonitor, and the Forger of Worlds to begin creating kind of like a new multiverse that basically, ended up in its current form as it exists now. And of course, included things like, Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, Crisis on Infinite Earths, different things like that. But the idea was that Perpetua has basically been released by Lex Luthor, and Lex Luthor is kind of reverted back into one of her apex predators. Right now, the way this played out was originally these predators were ultimately split, right? One part of them kind of became humans, the other part became Martians. And so with Lex Luthor absorbing Martian Manhunter, that's how we kind of reverted back into this sort of apex version of a character, or these kind of soldiers that were used by Perpetua in order to rule the universe, or rule the multiverse. And her vision of the multiverse is a dark place, right? It's a very dark and very harsh environment. And so in order to keep this victory from happening by the Legion of Doom, what ended up happening is the Justice League was really split into two parts. One part basically went into the past, the other part went into the present, and then another part basically stayed in the present day. But the idea is that they're essentially traveling throughout the entire time stream to find these artifacts, these pieces of the totality, which can be assembled and be used, which is their only real chance of defeating Perpetua because of the fact that it has so much incredible power. And so the version of the Justice League that went into the past, including the Flash, Green Lantern, John Stewart, and so on, ended up running into the Justice Society of America, and that's where this picks up. Now, here's the important thing to understand here, and here's kind of the interesting thing about this, is a lot of this is being viewed by Brainiac, right? Brainiac's basically kind of continuing along the path of bottling up cities, different things like that, but we don't really know exactly what his role is in all this, insofar as, outside of being part of the Legion of Doom and bottling up worlds, and ensuring the Justice League can't find the totality and the various aspects of the time stream. It basically leads to like the JSA and this version of the Justice League encountering each other, but they've never met and they don't know who the other is. And this is kind of an important thing, right? Because one part of this really kind of leads into the idea of Doomsday Clock, which is to say the fact that 10 years from these heroes' memories were basically missing. But the other part of this is that technically the JSA doesn't exist in DC. And the reason why is because if you guys remember from Doomsday Clock, the JSA was formed by Green Lantern Alan Scott. But because of the fact that Dr. Manhattan had basically intervened and Alan Scott died before he could attain his Green Lantern, the JSA was never formed. And so there was no indication that characters like Jay Garrick or any of those guys ever existed. Now, Doomsday Clock will likely rectify all of that when the final issue comes out, but as it stands at the moment, Barry does not know who Jay Garrick is, and Jay Garrick does not know who Barry is. Now, this is a particularly interesting continuity error considering the fact that Barry Allen, during the events of the Button, knew who Jay Garrick was, right? So that's why things are kind of finicky here. That's why things are kind of funny. It's a little strange in terms of how it all comes together. This is likely just a massive continuity error by DC. But the cool thing about this is that for people who were fans of the JSA, you get to see them in spectacular fashion, right? You get to see Jay Garrick, you get to see Alan Scott really being the kind of heroes that they were. Now, in terms of why they're in this particular point in time, why they're in this era, we don't know explicitly when this time period takes place. We simply just know that it's in the past. But before we get into that, what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to Kamandi, basically the last human being alive on Earth in this future where you have Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and so on, and animals have really kind of risen up. Now, of course, we covered how all this transpired in the first video, so you're welcome to go check that out to kind of get the origin of how this future ended up the way that it was. But of course, they're immediately set upon by all these members of these Brainiac robots and so on and so forth, these kind of police force or what have you. But essentially what you end up getting here is basically them tracking down and trying to locate the Hall of Justice. And it's kind of a cool little thing here, because once they're able to locate the Hall of Justice itself, and once they're able to kind of initiate their plan, ultimately it allows them to actually leave this universe and start traveling to the other universes that Brainiac has at his disposal. And the reason why is because the totality could be in any one of those. And that's what really makes the situation so hairy, is because because what they're looking for is essentially a needle in a stack of needles, right? I mean, they literally have to go through every single one of these universes that Brainiac has and try to find the totality in each one, right? So it's going to be kind of a crazy thing because totality is only in one of them, right? And that's where things kind of get crazy and kind of get bonkers, is because ultimately they have to use this kind of beacon of sorts to try to locate it, but it'd be insanely difficult to find. Now, of course, at the same time, you've got the present day Justice League, which is to say the Forger of Worlds and the Monitor alongside Hawkgirl and so on, who basically go into bleed space, right? Because their idea is to locate the AntiMonitor. Now, for those of you guys who aren't familiar with bleed space, the bleed itself in DC is essentially the space between universes, right? So it's like if I took a whole bunch of golf balls and I put them in a sink of water, all that water represents the bleed, right? The space between the different universes, and each one of those golf balls is a universe itself, right? So that's really all that is. Now, normally you're talking about an extremely dangerous place to try to navigate through, right? I mean, you can't take any kind of technologically advanced vessel from DC or from the main DC universe and just fly into bleed space and be fine. It would probably tear it to pieces, right? That's the reason why you have the Multiversal Justice League, for example, which uses a specialized ship in order to do it. And this particular vessel has been retrofitted by the Forger of Worlds and the Monitor in order to try to maintain and sustain itself while they're traveling through the bleed, but there's no guarantee. But the cool thing about this, and this is kind of an interesting takeaway from this, is that what you end up getting is basically this kind of recollection, or at least this instance whereby when Superman and his forces travel from one of the universes of Brainiac into another, they essentially end up encountering a group that really refers to themselves as the Justice Legion A. Now, Justice Legion A also stands for Justice Legion Alpha, and longtime DC fans will immediately recognize this group because this is the version of the Justice League from DC 1 million. And that's kind of the dangerous thing about this, because what it shows is that as part of the Legion of Doom from Lex Luthor, what Brainiac has been doing is running all throughout the time stream and basically capturing all these different universes, or all these little portions of a universe from all throughout the time stream, right? From the very, very distant past all the way up to the distant future. And so that's what makes things so crazy, and that's why they have to jump from one container basically to the next, trying to find the totality wherever it may be among all these different universes. It's an insane kind of goal to have to achieve, but the Justice Legion Alpha is an exceedingly powerful team, right? Because in the DC 1 million landscape, the Justice League really evolved beyond its role of being a protector of the world, and instead it evolved out to become a protector of the galaxy. And so Justice Legion Alpha has its base of operations on Jupiter, and they're charged with protecting the solar system, right? So basically what you're getting here is the DC 1 million team, which is kind of cool to see them return here. At the same time, and I don't know how I really feel about this, we basically end up finding out that this particular group of the Justice Society of America, of course, it's operating in 1945 during World War II, and the Legion of Doom forces who have made their way into the past, really kind of try to cut off this superhero team, are basically piloting Japanese planes in order to attack Pearl Harbor, which is kind of it's kind of a crappy thing to do, I think. Kind of weird, kind of strange. But the reason why you had the JSA during 1945 is because when you had the JSA originally in DC, they were basically like an Earth 1, an alternate reality team, right? I mean, originally they were World War II characters, but when DC created the Multiverse, they basically said, okay, so essentially like all the superheroes, or I guess the version of the Justice League that Jay Garrick was a part of is on Earth 2, and this new Justice League is on Earth 1. That's basically it. When you got to Crisis on Infinite Earths, the entire multiverse was wiped away and the JSA went with it, right? Because if there was no alternate reality, there'd be no basis for the JSA to exist. But it did have a huge fan base. And so what DC did is they came back with the reintroduction of the JSA, and what they said was that the JSA fought during World War II. They were basically superheroes who existed during the 1940s and 1950s. And so by the time Superman rose to prominence, by the time Clark Kent moved to Metropolis and became Superman, by the time that Bruce Wayne's parents were murdered, he went and trained and then came back to Gotham and became Batman. By the time all these modern era superheroes rose to prominence, the JSA had been retired. And so when you got to the events before the New 52 in 2011, the JSA was basically a bunch of retired superheroes who came out of retirement and back into active superheroing again. And that's how you got those teams unified together. It's why you see them here during World War II. This is really kind of a bookend way, I think, for Scott Snyder to kind of bring the JSA back and to say, well, this is probably how they're going to return. Yes, they were there during World War II, and what's likely going on here during Doomsday Clock, especially when we saw like Johnny Thunder and characters like that, who were originally part of the JSA, is their minds were wiped. They don't know who they are. Characters like Jay Garrick were removed and thrown into the Speed Force, and all the other members of the JSA don't know who they are, right? Alan Scott's dead. Johnny Thunder is stuck in an insane asylum. Everybody thinks he's crazy when he's saying that like he's got crazy powers and so on and so forth. Jay Garrick's in the Speed Force, and any other members of the JSA had likely had their memories wiped by Manhattan, which is why they're not active anymore, right? So, I mean, there's all kinds of little things that can go into it, little tidbits here and there that can really kind of clear all this up. But what it does is it basically shows us, kind of going into this tale a little bit here, it shows us that essentially Aquaman is is working on behalf of the AntiMonitor. That during the story where Aquaman was supposed to have died, the Drowned Earth event, where Aquaman was supposed to have been removed and killed off, what the AntiMonitor did was essentially save him and then turn him into a henchman for himself. Now, the reason why that's the case actually becomes prominent here in a minute. And the reason why, and this is particularly important, is because there's a conversation that takes place between Wonder Woman and Kamandi. Basically, what ends up going on here is that in this future, this DC 1 million future, that the Justice League temporarily faces off against the Justice Legion A. It's not a great big huge knockdown, drag out fight. Instead, they're basically fighting these kind of these other forces out there and ultimately end up defeating them. But there's this conversation Wonder Woman has in the sense that Kamandi comes from an age when war is all they really know, right? Like war is what brought the downfall of society, but the world that he lives in is harsh, and it's really kind of not really every man for himself so much as survive by whatever means you can. And so as a result of that, where Kamandi comes from a future where you do have little civilizations there and little pockets of groups and things like that where people do work together, for the most part he's used to a very harsh environment. And so when he looks back on the recollection, or at least on these stories of old, right, you know, the world being plunged into war and things like that, his perception of the past is that all humanity did was engage in war. And so when he met the Justice League and they basically showed him that, hey, it's not all just about warfare. There's things like compassion, things like hope, and that's what warfare is predicated on. We fight these fights because we want to ensure that people who are innocent don't really end up getting caught in these things, but also because by defeating these bad guys, there's hope for a better tomorrow. It really kind of seems to instill in the idea of Kamandi to simply not just run away. This idea that he's really kind of the only hope they have insofar as he'll do what needs to be done in order to help try to save the day. And so ultimately what ends up happening is one of the members of the Justice Legion is housing the totality itself. And so because of the fact that the intention, once Brainiac 1 million reveals himself, where the intention is to use this power to essentially take out the Justice Legion as well as the Justice League of America, incapacitate them, most likely force them into subservience by turning them into his soldiers or what have you, that the totality is taken by Wonder Woman and given to Kamandi, and then basically Kamandi is sent out in order to ensure the survival of the totality. That's exceedingly important. What we end up doing is jumping back to the past, and probably one of the coolest things, because where this whole battle is raging during World War II, you know, with regards to the attack on Pearl Harbor, all these soldiers, right, when the USS Arizona is hit by a torpedo and sunk, where under normal circumstances and in real world history, a litany of soldiers die during that whole scenario. Instead, Aquaman comes to the rescue with a Kraken. And it's one of the coolest things, right? To see him just like pop up with this enormous Kraken. But it's kind of a funny thing because what he does is he tells them like, look, I get you guys are here to get the totality and that's cool and everything, but you can't succeed, right? There's no way you guys can win here. It's not really possible. And so it's kind of a funny thing here because when you get this whole thing unfolding, it's like, okay, so like all fingers and all scenarios are pointing to the idea that what the Justice League is doing is that while they're trying their best, there's nothing they really can do. There's nothing they can do to win because the power of Perpetua is growing every second of every day. And it's getting to the point where it's basically uncontainable, right? Where it can't be stopped. And so what you end up having is Perpetua, who basically travels with Lex Luthor directly to the very edge of all things in existence and ultimately meets with the AntiMonitor. And the question is, which side does the AntiMonitor choose? And it's kind of a cool thing here because you would look at the AntiMonitor as a character and you would say, okay, so it's always been a villain, right? The AntiMonitor has led to the destruction of the multiverse in the first Crisis on Infinite Earths event. And then while it didn't really reappear in the traditional sense until Darkseid War, as far as it actually being a being that exists out there, the events of Darkseid War, the events that led up to it, like Forever Evil, saw the AntiMonitor traveling from one universe to the next and continuing to wipe it out, right? So he's always kind of been this force of nature, almost Galactus to a degree, but with a little more hint of evil in him. But when you have this scenario unfold, ultimately the AntiMonitor ends up siding with the Forger of Worlds, the Monitor, and the Earth's superheroes. And so what this shows is that essentially everybody has it out for Perpetua, right? Like everybody's against Perpetua here. But it's kind of a cool scenario because the way that Scott Snyder plays this out is, okay, but like they can't really win anyway, and it doesn't really even matter. And this is really kind of comes to a head when you end up having the Forger of Worlds who goes to attack Perpetua and nothing happens. And it's kind of a cool little moment because what ends up happening is, of course, they basically end up merging into the Ultra Monitor, basically this gigantic monitor unto itself, like this single ultra powerful being that was one of the forces, or really kind of the total force that ended up defeating Perpetua in the first place. But all indications seem to point to the idea that Perpetua's power is either at or a little bit higher than it was when when they originally fought. And so she can't really be defeated in the traditional sense. Instead, it's going to require more ability than what was originally had in order to see her defeated. And so jumping back to the past with regards to the Justice League fighting alongside the JSA, their journey to find the totality after essentially stopping the Legion of Doom to a degree with regards to the attack on Pearl Harbor is that while the Legion of Doom appears to be incapacitated, their journey ends up taking them to Atlantis. And of course, this kind of coincides with the time in which Atlantis' king is basically missing. And so ultimately the Legion of Doom makes their move only to reveal that they've captured Poseidon. Now it's kind of a funny thing here because when that happens at the same time that takes place, you end up getting Vandal Savage and his Legionnaires Club. Now, Vandal Savage and Legionnaires Club is a group that we've seen in the early stories of Scott Snyder's run on Justice League that were after the totality and managed to capture a portion of it. And so what this looks like, and I'm not going to swear to this as an absolute truth, but what this looks like is the absolute past of the DC universe. This is actually the past, right? So basically they've gone into 1945 in the past of the main DC universe, meaning the Justice Society of America existed during that point in time, which begs the question, why don't they exist now? Again, tying back into the events of Doomsday Clock. It's a cool little bit of a revelation here, but where you have Brainiac 1 million, who's basically going off against the Justice League. The Justice League doesn't really seem to be able to defeat it just because of the fact that Brainiac 1 million is so incredibly powerful, where you've got the Justice League in the present day who aren't really able to do anything to stop Perpetua, and then you've got the Legionnaires Club basically showing up in the past. It all really points to the idea that capturing totalities, even if they can do it, won't fix everything, but it doesn't look like they can. It does not look like they can actually capture the pieces of the totality and save everything. And so what it does is it all falls down on the shoulders of Kamandi. And Kamandi begins addressing basically this particular group out there, this unseen, group out there, and says like, we need more people here, right? Like, we need more help. The Justice League as it exists now is not powerful enough on their own. We need more forces here. And that's when we end up finding out that Kamandi's not just talking to anybody. Kamandi's actually talking to the Justice League Unlimited group, talking to like Batman Unlimited, Superman Unlimited, all these characters. DC's taking the Unlimited universe, or at least Scott Snyder is, and rolling it into the Justice League comics. This is amazing. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace. I want to give a shout out to Jason C, Austin S, Jason S, Austin H, Phillip, and Austin B. We have a lot of Austins in our Patreon, as well as Genosis916. Genosis didn't give us a first and last name, so we kind of had to roll with it. I didn't mention your all's last names, but I want to say thank you to you all. By the way, your Rob Corps rings should be on their way. For our Honor Guard members of the Rob Corps, for these special patrons, your custom Rob Corps rings should be on their way. They're being shipped to me. After that, I will have them shipped to you. Stay tuned, keep your eye on Patreon and your messages, and you will hear about them coming to you. Thank you.